So for many years, we have not seen that all of these beautiful, wonderful crossroads may come with an ulterior motive and unexpected consequences. Let me give you 3 or 4 or 5 examples. So in 1972, Richard Nixon signed the Education Amendments of 1972, which says, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participating in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So that codified 20 U.S. Code Section 1681, and it has come to be known as Title IX. As the federal civil rights law and as the motivator, the underlying and underpinning federal impetus to provide adequate and comprehensive capacity for women to participate in sports. And so over the following ensuing 10 or 15 or 20 years, there were numerous lawsuits that said women should be able to participate as much as men do. And as a result, both in high schools and colleges, any of the publicly funded schools or publicly federally benefited schools were required to add girls' sports. Great idea, you know. We finally got it out of the situation where the only thing women could do was be cheerleaders. It's a perfect deal. And we all cheered it, no question about it. And the fact that we have women and women athletes is a great testament to Title IX. We also, as a result of that, we provided sexual opportunity for girls, and it was part of the 60s and 70s equal rights sort of thing, which allowed the conceptualization of women in all kinds of areas engaging in activities that were historically considered male. And at the time that in 1972, men in most areas outnumbered women almost 2 to 1 in colleges. And today that has almost flipped. And in many professions, women make up a huge majority of the graduates and a significant majority of the professional graduates, master's and doctorate degrees, medical doctors, veterinarians, which would amaze a lot of people, especially rural guys like me, who saw veterinarians as the guys that that wrestled down the horses and pulled calves in January and February in 40 below weather in Montana. So now we have 70 or 80% of the people graduating from veterinary schools are women. So there are tremendous changes, and that has all kinds of positive consequences. But in the process of that, we have also had some other trends which go all the way from NAFTA, which is seemingly unrelated to what I'm just got done talking about, which was supposed to open up international trade. And when Clinton proposed it, it was supposed to greatly improve the economies, not only of this country, but many other countries, and it was going to free up trade, and it was going to open us up to more sophisticated jobs, whereas the people who had less educational and cultural sophistication were going to do the menial things that we didn't want to do. And of course, as a result, we ended up with most of our manufacturing and many of the other things that provided middle-class jobs and union jobs to people throughout the country that went away. And one of the things I watched, and it was really interesting, was that there was a controversial pulp plant in Montana that they ended up scrubbing and putting all kinds of fancy electronic devices in to keep the valley from turning green at night when they let out the plumes of stink. And it was a very successful and good employer in the community because it provided uplifting jobs, jobs that made really good money and middle-class jobs. But what happened to it when we post-NAFTA is that it was completely dismantled and removed from the United States. All of the ecologists paraded around saying, great, we finally got it out of the community. And at the same time, what they didn't recognize was that it was probably put on a barge offshore. All the scrubbing, all the water and emission stuff was removed from it, put it in international waters, had barges bring wood chips to it, and run the plant on the giant barges and dump the effluent into the ocean and into the air. And yes, it got it out of the valley in Missoula, Montana, but it put it everywhere else. And the process of that took away thousands and thousands of middle-class jobs that helped to stabilize the community. At the same time, and these are some of the other parts that tie this together. At the same time that we were doing all of this, we were saying, well, women have equal rights and they should have equal rights to jobs. At the time, 60 or 70% of the women of marriage age were stay-at-home mothers, and they took care of their kids. And that was denigrated. It was thought to be a low-lying job. It was something that real women, that women who were highly educated, that were competitive, that should be graduates and in the work pool wouldn't do. And so for a time, if you said you were a housewife, people would turn up their nose, if you recall. The problem with it is that as those middle class jobs went away, and as more and more women entered the workforce, which is a positive thing, and as more and more women had choices, which is a great and positive thing, we ended up instead with more and more two-family house or two wage earner households that were barely, and this is what's happening today, that are barely holding on to the bottom of middle class, because all of those lucrative jobs that men for the most part did 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that provided middle class living are now gone, and both of the couple are now working. 70% of women working age are working now instead of about 20 or 30%. And while that looks like a good thing from an equal rights standpoint, it certainly doesn't look like a good thing from a middle class standpoint, both because kids are now being raised by daycare and by kindergarten and preschool, and not by their parents. And secondly, because two people are now having to work twice as hard to stay in middle class and to keep their family home. So we have those things, and it is the destruction of the middle class. And concurrent with that, we have all of these things which are now assaulting the whole gender idea. And it began, some people would say, well, it began in the last 10 or 15 years. I'm going to say to you that it's part of the Title IX thing, not because Title IX is bad, but because there were, even in the 70s, there were implications that were more broad-reaching. Remember Richard Raskind? Do you remember Richard Raskind? No, you don't. But do you remember Renee Richards? That's a whole different thing. So Renee Richards was and he's still alive, I guess, was a 6'1" tall tennis player who was a second-tier level tennis player in the 60s and 70s, who got a sex change. And in 1975, she was changed from a man to a woman, and then applied to be a competitive pro tennis player. And the New York Supreme Court approved that in 1977. She went on to compete and was rated as high as the 20th highest woman. So here we have a person 6'1" that has an X and a Y chromosome competing in women's tennis. And there were people who applauded it at the time. I'm sure many people would applaud that today. What we don't necessarily see is that's how we ended up in the same trend on transgender bathrooms and all the rest of this stuff that is going on now. And what's more, so she went on to coach Martina Navratilova to a couple Wimbledon titles, and was, was a successful person in her own right. And I give her credence for that. But the downside of that is that we've ended up with when I was in Seattle, they were called the metrosexuals, the boys, the men, young men who eschewed being masculine and carried purses and the whole rest of this, who dressed more as dandies, and they were rewarded for being more, for embracing their feminine side. Let me put it that way. And that is to say, I don't find fault with that. I embrace my own feminine side, and someday I'll share with you in ways that I have done that and have done it for years. But it is, that's not, I'm not outing myself. That's just another story to tell. So we have people like, and the other thing that went on in 1973, there was the big thing, the Battle of the Sexes. Do you remember it? Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. And so a 1940 tennis pro took on a 1973 number one tennis player, and many of us cheered for Billie Jean King, and Billie Jean King won. It was kind of fun, really. It was fun to see the equality of the sexes. But in the process, again, we have this gender neutralization. We have women now doing combat roles. Is it good they're fighter pilots? Yeah, it's great. Is it going to be good that they're in the trenches? I'm not so sure. I don't necessarily have the same kind of feelings about it. And so as a result, we now have these third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh gender identifications, the neutral identification. Some states are already moving to a third gender identity so that people can be either both sexes or neither. Lionel Nation makes a joke out of the fact that there are about 17 different designations, LGBT and blah, 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 and others beyond that. And again, I think it's great that people have their own identity and can embrace their own identity. The problem with it is that it is being foisted on the rest of us. And the case in point, which is kind of what triggered me into this whole process today, is that the Boy Scouts, as of yesterday, are not Boy Scouts anymore. They are Scouts BSA. And I don't know what BSA means if it doesn't mean Boy Scouts of America. But it is now open to both genders. And so while they fought over keeping out homosexual inclined boys and homosexual inclined scout leaders over the last 20 years, they are now moving to complete gender neutrality. And I'm going to tell you that I find real fault and problem with that. As a kid who was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout, I'm going to tell you I find real problem with it, because there are things which boys do as they learn to become men, things that women do as they learn, girls do as they learn to become women, which are best done, as I see it, in the company of their own gender and in the company of people who are not abusing or taking advantage of them, that are also encouraging them to experiment and explore their own gender, not in sexual ways, but for years and years I was a scout leader and took kids out on anywhere from 6 to 14-day trips in the wilderness area, and those kids learned to become men. But it also included boys running around naked in the creek, boys sharing space in the tents, boys having fun doing all kinds of juvenile male things. I won't get into when I was a kid the fart contests that went on at Boy Scout camp that made the tent impossible to breathe in. But the fact of the matter is that those things are going to be in large account lost as a result of the gender neutralization of both genders having some separation and having some advantages to being separate as kids as they mature through their own adolescence. And so now we see the other side of this, which is also part of the game, which is this gender neutralization, and our Supreme Court Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg talking about girls being able to approve sexual relations at age 12 or earlier, and that there really isn't anything wrong with sexualizing young kids. And so we have all of these things merging now: the loss of gender, the loss of occupational identity, the loss of gender separation, the loss of roles in the community, and we all have coupled with it the mix of children and adults in all kinds of complex ways that kids did not have before. And does that make them mature better, mature in a more well-rounded way? Does it make them safe? Does it provide them the opportunity to explore who they are? You know, I don't think any of that's true. And what's more than that, culturally, all of this stuff is simultaneously destroying the cultural matrix by which, the fabric by which we maintain a culture. And secondly, it puts us all into a workload, marching, neutralized, neutered workforce, which perfectly fits the New World Order, which is to say you all just wear the same outfits. It's the classic communist marching unit that has no gender, that has no identity, that have no faces, that have no expression. And all of this is supposed to be neutralized out. And if it doesn't sound a little bit like George Orwell to you, if it doesn't sound a little bit like 1984, if it doesn't look now, which I didn't see years ago, like a whole bunch of not inconsequential or consequential benefits that were being sold to us, but in fact that this is part of an agenda which, when you put it all together, makes us nothing but a bunch of expendable sheep, all interchangeable and removable. The eugenics process of this is not lost on me anymore, and the trends that seemed innocent and beneficial at the time now no longer seem all that beneficial entirely or innocent. And so as we look at what has happened to us culturally, as we look at the destruction of our culture, as we look at the destruction of the middle class, and now as the fabric of even our own gender identification starts to break down, I see it not simply as just the gradual withering away of cultural distinctiveness, but rather an intentional process that has been managed against our own benefit and against our interests for at least 50 years, and perhaps for much longer. It is incremental creep of it. So I'm going to put on my thumbnail the new look of the Boy Scouts, and that's the reason for it. Thanks so much for watching. I really see this as challenging to us and a very mixed bag. If you like it, give a thumbs up. If you like, subscribe. Thanks so much for supporting, and the big announcement still coming.